Unit 6 is going to start with the 1960s. We had just gotten through in Unit 5 through the 1950s, and we talked a bit about the 60s with John F. Kennedy, starting all that. But we're going to talk about the 60s as really starting with Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ. We're going to try to assess significant immediate and long-term domestic and foreign policy turning points of the Cold War, which is a huge nonsense essential question. We'll get into some of those things in just a minute, but we're talking about civil rights and really Vietnam here. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. But just to recap, when we talk about the 1950s, this standard really does look at the Civil Rights Act. So some of the big important things that happened during the Civil Rights Act, we got the Montgomery bus boycotts. Remember, that was when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat up. That leads to the year-long bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a hero, or at least a celebrity, not even celebrity. He becomes a public figure and starts his nonviolent civil disobedience program. Then we got Brown versus the Board of Education, not part of the 60s. That's the early 1950s. But Brown versus the Board of Education attempted to force integration in public schools. Then the Little Rock Nine tested that implementation, which led to all of the stuff with the paratroopers having to relieve the National Guard and Eisenhower having to really step up and try to protect civil rights with those paratroopers there. Then we saw that after the Brown versus the Board of Education, the school was actually closed down because racism hurts the white population and the black population in the sense that services that would normally be provided universally to everybody are taken away because the black folks were also benefiting from them. We also talked about sit-ins, but let's recap that again here. The sit-in is what you see right here at segregated facilities like this counter, this lunch counter, which is a public area. And according to according to the protest, they wanted to have access to those areas as well, not because they thought the food was better, but because just the fact that there's segregation is inherently wrong. This is the Greensboro 4 over here, and they were civil disobedience, right? Nonviolent civil disobedience. They waited to be served. When they weren't served, they just kept waiting. Eventually, the violence turns against them. People would dump stuff on their heads, use racial slurs, sometimes even physically strike them. And when all of this information got out into the public, it really starts to turn people away from the racism because they start to see the violence in the system. All of this nonviolent civil disobedience stuff can be seen in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also called SNCC. One of the most important presidents of SNCC is John Lewis, who we're going to see later at the Selma marches. SNCC, along with Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, are going to be involved in aggressive nonviolence, meaning they're going to put themselves in positions where they will be violently attacked intentionally. They're aggressive about this because they're trying to demonstrate the violence that is part of white supremacy. They're challenging legal segregation, like this segregated lunch counter, like the segregated schools, like the segregated bus facilities. They're challenging that de jure legal racial segregation in public facilities. I do want to show a couple of images here. Nonviolent sit-ins were more than just the lunch counters. This is a public swimming pool over here. This is an integrated challenging of a segregated swimming pool. There are black and white folks in this pool. And this guy up here who is pouring something into the pool, he's pouring acid into the pool because he wanted to challenge the idea of integrating the pools. A couple of other challenges here. We have above my head right here, these are the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were, again, an integrated effort to test the integration of facilities in the South. according to legislation, the interstate commerce, meaning buses that go in between states, were supposed to be integrated. Young people, ages really 18 to the early 20s, some a little bit older, decided to get on buses. The first ride took two buses. They went into the South to test to see how integrated the facilities were. They were not. Um, by the time they got to Alabama on these first freedom rides, that's what they called these freedom rides. The Ku Klux Klan had made a deal with the local police. The police were led by a guy named Bull Connor. He'll come back in a minute. The police gave the Ku Klux Klan time to attack the first bus. The Klan members pulled everybody off the bus, one of the buses, beat them mercilessly. The second bus, they set on fire, hoping to burn everyone alive. People that were on the bus said they were looking for the easiest way to die. Now they get off the buses, and this is the aftermath here. What the Freedom Rides did was force the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, to protect them, something that the president did not want to have to do because it was a political stance that would be unpopular with the Southern Democrats, right? Those folks that had already shown that they were willing to break away when they formed the Dixiecrat Party. Another example of civil rights is this guy down here in the center. That's James Meredith. James Meredith was a veteran, wanted to go to the University of Mississippi, so known as Ole Miss. He's the first one that integrates Ole Miss. Here in South Carolina, we have people that were the first to integrate Clemson, and the University of South Carolina. That was after James Meredith. I believe Henry Gantt was the first to integrate USC, and that was in the late 60s. Kind of crazy how recent that was. Oh, Meredith, after he integrated Ole Miss, decided to go on a tour across the South, which he called the March Against Fear. And while he was simply walking across the state with publicity, a white guy drove by and shot him. Didn't kill him, shot him in the leg. Other civil rights advocates pick up that march, but it just goes to show you how much fear there was among, especially those white supremacists trying to stop all of this integration. Remember Bull Connor from the Freedom Rides? Well, Bull Connor is responsible for this. The civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr. and his SCLC, was constantly out trying to find areas that would be a place where they could challenge violent racism. They had a number of efforts to do so. Some of them didn't go very well for them because they didn't get the reaction they wanted. So they decided to go to the most segregated place in America. At least that's what they referred to it as. And that was Birmingham, Alabama, sometimes called Bombingham because of the number of black churches that had been bombed in the area. And again, practicing aggressive nonviolence. They knew that they were going to be attacked. There is a huge, long campaign, 3 or 4 days. They were marching in the streets. You can see here that this is where we see the police dogs are turned on the protesters. The fire hoses are turned on protesters. And all of this is televised. And that is going to turn some of those sort of moderate white voters in favor of civil rights because they don't want to be associated with this, right? They don't want to be associated with the violence that's inherent in the system. So they're going to support some efforts to change, which all kind of gets wrapped up in this. This is Martin Luther King Jr., and he wrote a letter called The Letter from Birmingham Jail, because when he was in Birmingham, he was arrested. He was arrested for the protest, and while he was in jail, he wrote a letter, and he sends it to supporters outside of Birmingham. You see, he was called an outside agitator, meaning that he wasn't a good Southern Alabama, Birmingham black person who knew his role. He was coming in and riling up. And if it wasn't for people like Martin Luther King Jr. telling these black folks that they should be upset, they wouldn't have been upset. The the subjugated people, the people that were being oppressed, knew they were being oppressed, but they also knew that this is what happens when you start speaking up. So when King comes in and starts leading an effort to get rid of this, right, get rid of this, people blamed King for showing just how bad the system was. So they called him an outside agitator. It's a term that commonly gets thrown around still. Anyways, in this letter to Birmingham, King writes, not criticizing these folks, right? Because everybody knew that that this was happening in Birmingham. The people that King really criticizes, and this is interesting, is the moderate white supporters that had accepted the status quo. He's like, we anticipated this. We knew that these people are going to be hard to get rid of. What we need is, as a Black community, what we need is the help of the white community that's kind of in the middle, and they need to join the call for civil rights. I think that's an interesting message. Later, in 1963, a little bit later on, in support of the proposed Civil Rights Amendment by John F. Kennedy, King and others organized a March on Washington, officially referred to as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, because even then they knew that economics and economic equality was as important as social and political equality. You may find these names familiar. A. Philip Randolph had threatened to march on Washington during World War II in order to end discrimination in the jobs industry, and it leads to Executive Order 8802, I think, which ended discrimination in the jobs industry. John Lewis, he's one of the people that was the leaders of SNCC, the SNCC, and Bayard Rustin, who was a writer at the time, very important. And they were trying to support the civil rights law. Now, the civil rights law will fail even with all of the eloquence and all of the support that was shown on the March on Washington. And yes, the March on Washington has the "I Have a Dream" speech. And Martin Luther King Jr., you can see here, was criticizing the United States for failing to live up to the all men are created equal part of the Declaration of Independence. It's a very moving speech. People still quote it, sometimes not understanding what really was being said there. He's not saying that we should be colorblind. What he's saying is the United States promised equality for everybody and has failed to live up to that promise. There is a backlash to this. Following this, I mean, it doesn't really fix anything. The civil rights legislation fails. Birmingham, a Black church, was bombed the next day, killing 3 or 4 Black girls. At this point in history, Martin Luther King Jr. was very unpopular. Even at the time of his death, only about 30% of the American public thought that he was a positive figure in the world. So it takes a long time for people to finally come around to understand what was happening here. Just remember, a lot of this is based on the fact of the Great Migration is continuing through the 60s. You see the Black area here in the South, that is losing population. Meanwhile, the kind of gray areas you can see up here, excuse me, New York, Pennsylvania, over to Wisconsin, Illinois, that's gaining population. That's the Great Migration. Some of that was causing some of the issues because Black folks were moving into traditionally white areas, causing some of that. But let's talk about Freedom Summer, because even after the Civil Rights Act, right, people were starting to push for voting rights. In addition to just ending de jure segregation, they wanted African Americans in the South to have voting rights. For example, in Mississippi, excuse me, only 6% of eligible Black voters were registered there. Legally, they could register, but there was also laws in place, like the law that Black voters had to publish their names in the paper before they could vote, intentionally designed to cause violent opposition to their voting. Freedom Summer was an effort to take an integrated set of individuals from the North into the South, help voters register, educate them on how to do so without being having a lot of danger. And yet, on the very day that Freedom Summer started, 3 SNCC workers were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. These are the 3. 2 of them were Jewish, 1 was Black. When the investigators went to find what had happened because Mississippi wasn't doing anything about this. So federal investigators go in, and they actually found 8 other bodies in the swamp where they thought that these 3 had been murdered. It turns out that the people that killed them, one of them flipped, admitted to what they did. They end up finding all these other bodies, which means this isn't the first time that these things had happened. We would call this the lynching, basically. Even with all of this, the power of Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent tactics are being questioned. There's some effectiveness, but it's taking a while. You can see the racism present here. This is Mississippi. The only way to end blank is extermination, right? This is white supremacy, nationalism. This is genocide. All of that stuff wrapped in there. I also think it's important to point out the other symbolism that's in these images. Because people were starting to question Martin Luther King Jr.'s tactics in the mid-'60s, we start to see the rise of a couple of other alternative methods. The Black Power movement starts to question that nonviolent civil disobedience. You get people like Malcolm X over here, other people like Stokely Carmichael, the Black Panther Party down here. They all form this concept of Black Power. They are less interested in integration. They're fine with staying separate because they feel like the institutions have been used against the Black community, so therefore they should form their own institutions. They also accept violent self-defense. They're not going to go out and attack first, but if a white supremacist tries to attack them, it's fine to strike back. All of this is different from what King and the SCLC and the SNCC had been promoting. The Black Panther Party is rather interesting as well. It was formed as a way to try to police themselves. They tried to eliminate the state-sponsored police, right? What would we call the police? They wanted to get them out of their neighborhood in, I believe it was Oakland, because the police had killed Matthew Johnson. So as a response to that police killing, it was supposed to be a self-policing group, a self-protection group, and they do other things as well. They created the country's first free lunch program, trying to feed hungry students. So there's other things that are going on there as well. It's mildly effective. It does encourage more Black history. It does get the civil rights movement out of the South. It's going to focus more on just the Jim Crow laws. But it also has its limitations like nonviolent civil disobedience does. One group that we really need to think about is the role of the Supreme Court. And in the 1960s, the Supreme Court had what they called a liberal shift. And by liberal, we mean that they were more interested in protecting civil rights and civil liberties. We can see this in several Supreme Court cases. Engel versus Vitale in 1962 ended mandatory school prayer. These all have been much debated since the 60s. Gideon versus Wainwright said that even the poor have the right to have a lawyer. Miranda versus Arizona said you have to be notified of your rights when you're arrested. Roe versus Wade in the early 70s sets up the idea that women had the right to abortion access up until the 3rd trimester. It's a little complicated. We'll talk about that more later. All of this leads to a conservative backlash. The Supreme Court Chief Justice in the 60s was this guy here. This is Earl Warren. Earl Warren was actually put on the court, I believe, by Nixon. And yet he was considered sort of the liberal that was causing all these changes and protecting civil liberties. People didn't see any of this as protecting civil liberties. A lot of conservatives saw this as protecting criminals and ending Christian culture. So they were openly calling for his impeachment because they didn't agree with his decisions. Interesting stuff we'll talk about more later. And then in 1963, Lyndon Johnson becomes president when John F. Kennedy is assassinated. That's all we're going to say about that. I don't believe in promoting conspiracy theories, so we don't know really what happened other than Kennedy's assassinated. Lyndon Johnson is going to use John F. Kennedy's memory to push through the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. He essentially guilt trips Congress into passing civil rights. And in 1964, he says, well, if You guys love John F. Kennedy so much, put your money where your mouth is, and passed the Civil Rights Act, which is why he was in Dallas to promote that Civil Rights Act when he was assassinated. So in 1964, they passed the act. It ends de jure segregation in public areas nationwide. Any public space now had to be integrated. Congress uses the interstate commerce powers to end the discrimination. That is a congressional tactic that they used. And Lyndon Johnson, for his part, knew what was going to happen. Lyndon Johnson said, now that they've passed the Civil Rights Act, Southerners aren't going to vote for Democrats anymore. He said, we have just delivered the South to the Republican Party, and it's going to be a couple of election cycles before that really sinks in. But he's not wrong. The Deep South, the former Confederate states, they still are now a Republican stronghold, even 60 years later. Oh, look, more symbolism over here. When Johnson takes office, he's going to get elected in 64. He's going to serve out the entire term until 68. He could have run again for election in 68, just he doesn't. He's very pro civil rights, and he's going to fight a war on poverty. He calls this the Great Society Program, and the Great Society Program did things like fight generational poverty, provided Medicare and Medicaid for folks that otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford health care. Creates the food stamps program to fight food insecurity, to make sure that people that didn't know where their next meal was coming from would be able to have a next meal, and even tried to help education by creating the Head Start program, which helped traditionally underprivileged communities have a way to start educating their kids earlier. All of that is going to help fight poverty. Along with this pro-civil rights agenda, we can see that the Great Society Program of Johnson is really just a continuation and expansion of the New Deal. Both of them are using government money, using the government to help impact people's lives directly, and both are increasing federal spending on social welfare programs. Okay. When I say social welfare programs, it doesn't mean just handing out direct checks to people. That means that they're using government money in order to fund programs like Medicare, like Medicaid, like food stamps, like the CCC, like the AAA, things that would help the common person's lives and not just the rich folks. The problem was the Great Society was pretty poorly funded, mostly because Vietnam spending is going to take money away from those domestic programs that he was so hoping for. Also, the civil rights movement kind of gets bogged down in the late 60s, partially because of Vietnam. So none of it's as effective as he really hoped. Finishing up here with the Civil Rights Act stuff, in 1964, there was a protest that started in Selma over civil rights, and police killed Jimmy Lee Jackson during that protest. As a way to protest the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, civil rights advocates, including the SNCC, SNCC, decided to protest for voting rights by marching from Selma to Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. While they tried to start this protest, police attacked the marchers as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Edmund Pettus, of course, being a famous Ku Klux Klan member from that area. It's kind of symbolic. As the marchers were attempting to cross the bridge, police did this, and they violently attacked the marchers who were just waiting, trying to cross the bridge. Again, all of this is broadcast on television, and this is going to lead to people turning against the police brutality and in supporting the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. The United States finally lives up to the 15th Amendment, even passing the 24th Amendment, which prohibited poll taxes, which means that you did not have to pay in order to vote anymore. Trying to get rid of those Jim Crow laws that prevented African Americans from voting for so long. Next video, we'll talk about Vietnam.